So President Biden and Xi Jinping are expected to meet tomorrow for a pretty robust 4-hour meeting, and they're going to discuss many things that deal with both countries. I think they'll focus mostly on trade issues and global stability and security. There'll be two videos I make. This one's going to cover trade. Next one I'm going to make is going to cover global security and defense. Now, with regard to trade issues, the U.S. will bring up forced labor issues in China, intellectual property theft, as well as fentanyl trafficking. China will counter with technology embargoes that the U.S. and many of its allies have placed on China, the tariffs, as well as the U.S. decoupling from China. Now, starting with the U.S. concerns, the U.S. has criticized China on various trade issues, including allegations of forced labor, particularly in relation to the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And for those of you that aren't aware, China has forced a significant amount of its Muslim Uyghur population into forced labor camps, forcing them to make goods to offset the rising cost of Chinese national human capital. There's an estimated 2 million incarcerated Uyghurs who are undercutting wages to keep goods cheap in China as a part of exports. Incidentally, this cheap forced labor hurts the Chinese as well because it's causing record youth unemployment in China. These concerns were raised during a Senate Finance Committee hearing in February and emphasized the need to modernize trade laws as well as enforcement to create a level playing field and focus on human rights in trade between the U.S. and China. Moving on, the U.S. will talk about intellectual property theft or IP theft by Chinese entities, which has been a long-standing and contentious issue in international trade. Chinese IP theft often involves the unauthorized copying, use, or distribution of technology, software, trade secrets, or other intellectual property developed by foreign companies, particularly those based in the U.S., but Europe is also included. This theft can occur through various means, including cyber espionage, reverse engineering, and the coercive transfer of technology as a condition for market access. U.S. companies have long complained that IP theft from China has cost them billions of dollars in lost revenue and has given Chinese companies an unfair competitive advantage. In fact, the U.S. estimates China steals about $600 billion in intellectual property annually, which affects 45 million Americans in IP-intensive industries. The U.S. government has taken several measures to counteract the Chinese IP theft. These include imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, blacklisting Chinese companies like Huawei, enhancing cybersecurity measures, and increasing scrutiny on Chinese investments in American companies, particularly those in technology and critical infrastructure sectors. Beyond the U.S., other countries are also focusing on this. International businesses are as well. The issue contributes to a broader concerns about fair trade practices, market access, and global competitiveness of Chinese firms. Foreign companies have reported that the pressure to transfer their technology to its Chinese partners as a part of doing business in China, getting access to Chinese customers, they're forced to hand over their intellectual property to China, and that is considered an unfair practice. The Chinese government has often denied allegations of state-sponsored IP theft, but there are many examples that show that they have been sponsoring it. However, China has also made some efforts to strengthen its IP laws and enforcement in response to this international pressure, but the effectiveness and the enforcement of these laws really remains pretty weak and a point of contention. Moving on, the President Biden will also talk about fentanyl trafficking. The U.S. has expressed concerns about the flow of fentanyl and its ingredients from China. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is up to 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. Even a small amount can be lethal, making it a significant public health threat in the U.S. It's often cut into other drugs, increasing the risk of overdose. Nearly 110,000 Americans died due to fentanyl overdose last year. China has been identified as the primary source of fentanyl entering the United States, and Chinese laboratories have been manufacturing large quantities of fentanyl, some of which are shipped directly to the U.S. or Mexico, where drug cartels distribute it to the U.S. The U.S. government has taken steps to address the flow of fentanyl from China, including diplomatic negotiations and law enforcement efforts, and the U.S. has urged China to crack down on production and the export of fentanyl and its ingredients, but obviously it's not enough, and this is going to come up in the discussion with Xi Jinping. U.S. senators have called for sanctions against China if China does not take steps to restrict fentanyl and its supply into Mexico, which the cartels are using to flood the U.S. Now, moving on to the Chinese concerns. There is a Chinese technology embargo that the U.S. has placed on Chinese tech firms and the CCP writ large. The U.S. has expressed concerns about the transfer of sensitive technology to China, especially technologies that could be used for military purposes. This includes advanced computing, artificial intelligence, and telecommunications equipment. The U.S. government has taken steps to restrict the exports of such technology to China and limit Chinese investment in American tech firms to protect national security. A prominent example I've already talked about is Huawei, which is a major telecommunications company. The U.S. has warned that Huawei's equipment could be used for espionage by the Chinese government and has discouraged its allies from using Huawei technology in their 5G networks, some of which have actually agreed and have banned Huawei from their countries. Taiwan also holds a strategic position in the global technology supply chain, with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, also known as TSMC, being a humongous advanced technology firm, and they're a global leader in semiconductor production. The U.S. is keen on ensuring the security and the supply chains of TSMC and Taiwan's production of technology, given its proximity to China, as well as the tensions it has with China. As such, the U.S. has brought other semiconductor juggernauts online with their embargo of China. These include Netherlands, Japan, South Korea, which is causing China to rapidly fall behind in the most advanced tech sectors. China will seek to negotiate relief from this pressure during this meeting with Joe Biden. Finally, we have trade volume, decoupling, and the tariffs. So far in 2023, U.S. imports of Chinese goods fell by 16.4%, which is a pretty significant number for China. And exports fell by 6% to China from the U.S., which is hurting China's attempt at economic recovery post-COVID. This is caused by this so-called U.S. decoupling or de-risking of ties to China, as well as the U.S. tariff campaign on Chinese imports and efforts to restrict the flow of U.S. technology to Beijing, which I just talked about. China is wanting to cease this decoupling as quickly as possible, which is why Xi is agreeing to meet with President Biden as well as U.S. business leaders. Since the high-level tensions of the balloon incident, the rhetoric out of China has actually softened as China continues to court U.S. investment and trade. European countries have also followed suit with their U.S. counterparts in their decoupling or de-risking. Much of this decoupling comes from increased labor and logistics costs relative to South America, but due to a greater focus on IP theft, human rights violations, and hiding their COVID response, as well as currency manipulation, among other things, leading U.S. businesses and agencies are deciding to change their stance on Chinese cooperation and pivot away from China. With regard to the trade war and the tariffs, these were initiated by President Donald Trump during his presidency, and they equate to about $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. China retaliated against U.S. products, with the majority of them being agricultural. Now, these tariffs and duties remain in place under the Biden administration, so they weren't really changed from Trump to Biden. The trade war was initially motivated by concerns over Chinese trade practices, such as forcing American companies to hand over their intellectual property, like I just said, and a significant portion of the U.S. exports comprise of agricultural goods, placing farmers really at the forefront of any changes in trade relations. And this is why Xi Jinping is expected to meet with agribusiness leaders from the U.S. This is because U.S. agriculture is mostly the target of Chinese counter tariffs. Trade will weigh heavy on China as China relies more on the U.S. economically than the U.S. relies on China, with the U.S. importing far more from China than it exports to China. This dynamic means that China relies heavily on the U.S. markets for its exports. A substantial portion of Chinese economic growth is driven by the export-led model, with the U.S. being one of the largest markets. Chinese exports to the U.S. primarily consist of manufactured goods, electronics, clothing, and other consumer products. These industries employ millions of Chinese workers, making the U.S. market crucial for China's industrial sector and labor market. A reduction in U.S. demand for these goods could have significant economic impacts in China, and Xi knows this. China's large trade surplus with the U.S. contributes significantly to its foreign exchange reserves as well, and currency. These reserves are important for maintaining stability of the Chinese yuan, as it is pseudo-pegged to the US dollar, which means it matters for China's overall financial health. A reduction in trade surplus due to decreased exports to the U.S. could impact China's currency stability and its financial markets. While China has been diversifying its trade partners, the U.S. still remains one of its most significant markets. 17% of China's exports went to the United States, making it the single largest destination for Chinese exports in the world. The US, on the other hand, has a more diversified range of trading partners, reducing its reliance on any single market, including China. Both Canada and Mexico are larger trading partners with the US than China by hundreds of billions of dollars each. 7 out of 10 China's top 10 trading partners are US allies, which China has concerns about. Furthermore, decoupling cuts the tap off for U.S. intellectual property and investment access, which China needs to account for a significant portion of its growth. And that's what we're looking at when it comes to trade.